In the previous spoiler, it was mentioned that after his strength improved, Luo Feng left the military base and returned to Yanji continent, preparing to eliminate King Purple Bell. The news of Luo Feng obtaining treasures on Yanji continent spread like wildfire, to the point that even King Jinyan personally contacted him, fearing that Luo Feng might get into serious trouble because of it. But after hearing Luo Feng's firm response, King Jinyan finally felt relieved. In fact, King Jinyan had always been keeping a close eye on Luo Feng's movements. Apart from being slightly concerned about the treasure incident, he was extremely satisfied with Luo Feng's performance on the extraterritorial battlefield. After all, regardless of the method, the fact that a world master could kill a low-tier king immortal was enough proof that Luo Feng was the most outstanding among his many disciples. In fact, the amount of wealth one accumulates can indirectly reflect their strength. On this point, even Luo Feng's third senior brother, King Bloodthirsty, who was also Dylan's teacher, was far inferior to Luo Feng. This showed that Luo Feng's potential had already surpassed many immortal-level powerhouses. Even so, King Jinyan solemnly warned Luo Feng to handle matters cautiously and not to let arrogance grow because of his current achievements. Meanwhile, in order to improve efficiency, Luo Feng spent a fortune to put out a bounty on King Purple Bell's whereabouts, instantly sparking a frenzied search across Yanji continent. After all, the reward he offered far exceeded the entire fortune of an ordinary marquis immortal. It was a wealth unmatched even by the accumulated spoils and military merits of countless years of battle in the extraterritorial battlefield for anyone at the Marquis Immortal level and below, making many Marquis Immortals were tempted to join in. Yet even so, no one managed to find any trace of King Purple Bell. What they didn't know was that King Purple Bell had long hidden outside of Yanji continent and had spent a fortune to hire powerful figures from the automaton race camp, including 2 Limit King Immortals, one of whom was King Heavy Arrow, to plot against Luo Feng. His plan was to lie low for a time, feigning weakness to mislead and lull Luo Feng into carelessness, then at the right moment, he would quietly return to Yanji continent, deliberately disguising himself as if his whereabouts had been accidentally exposed, and let a Marquis Immortal discover him. Both Luo Feng and King Purple Bell firmly believed that the methods they had prepared would surely kill the other and seize their treasures. Thus, even though Luo Feng knew full well that King Purple Bell's sudden reappearance was clearly a trap, he still invited a friend at Peak King Immortal level to teleport to the coordinates where the intel pointed. As a Peak King Immortal, King Purple Bell, though unable to directly detect Luo Feng due to the signal being blocked, with his keen perception of space fluctuations, he still quickly sensed teleportation fluctuations several thousand kilometers away, and immediately concluding that Luo Feng had entered the fray. What puzzled him was that the 2 teleportation waves connected almost seamlessly. Clearly, Luo Feng had only let a friend bring him here, and that friend had instantly departed with no intent to join the battle. King Purple Bell secretly sneered, believing Luo Feng to be far too arrogant, daring to think he could contend with him alone. Yet just as he was underestimating his foe, he suddenly sensed 2 terrifying waves of energy crashing toward him, shocking him into instantly teleporting away. This was precisely one of the reasons why powerhouses at Peak King Immortal level and above rarely perish in battle. The moment things turned unfavorable, they would immediately withdraw to avoid being dragged into an irretrievable predicament. Luo Feng understood this perfectly, which was why he had Irina strike first, not to hit, but to intimidate King Purple Bell, forcing him in his panic to reveal his trump cards. After all, if the battle reached its fiercest stage and the enemy suddenly unleashed a hidden killing move, the fight could be instantly overturned and even cost him his life. Only by first forcing the opponent into passivity could Luo Feng better seize control of the situation. Just as Luo Feng expected, King Purple Bell, out of caution, lingered at a distance for 10 seconds before teleporting back, immediately sending a message to summon his allies with the intent of ending things quickly. In his view, Luo Feng's ability to unleash attacks beyond his level clearly relied on some special means, and such means must have limitations, impossible to use repeatedly in a short time. After a round of taunting, King Purple Bell's allies indeed arrived. The 3 spread out into different positions, teleporting to encircle Luo Feng from all sides before launching their assault at the fastest speed. As the saying goes, know yourself and know your enemy, and you will never be defeated. When planning against King Purple Bell, Luo Feng had already investigated the background of every powerhouse around the enemy's barracks, especially verifying in detail those at the Limit King Immortal stage. Thus, he instantly recognized the 2 reinforcements King Purple Bell had invited. They were exactly the ones listed on his records. With a lineup of 1 Peak King Immortal and 2 Limit King Immortals, in numbers, level, and comprehension of the original laws, they far outclassed Luo Feng, appearing to hold absolute advantage. However, just as the 3 closed in, convinced of certain victory, They were startled to find that Luo Feng did not show any timidity. Little did they know, they had already, without realizing it, fallen into Luo Feng's calculations and stepped into the effective coverage of his spatial lockdown weapon. In an instant, all spatial fluctuations vanished. For Luo Feng had already activated the spatial lockdown. King Heavy Arrow and the other Limit King Immortal, who knew a little about Luo Feng's strength, were immediately taken aback. According to the intelligence, Luo Feng's comprehension of the laws was not high, making it supposedly impossible for him to master the three profound mysteries of the original law of space. But King Purple Bell was different. He had also entered the sacrificial tower, seen the faintly appearing sacrificial runes around, and immediately concluded that Luo Feng had successfully unlocked the treasure. The current spatial lockdown had to be the ability granted by that weapon. A weapon that allowed someone not fully versed in spatial lockdown to wield such a technique was already on par with a universe-venerable level armament. Even if Luo Feng possessed no other treasures, this single item alone could earn them a massive profit. Greed instantly ignited their murderous intent, making their attack even more ferocious. However, the three could not teleport, and their instantaneous bursts of speed were far slower than Luo Feng's. Through precise calculation, Luo Feng simultaneously dodged their attacks while skillfully guiding their movements, gradually narrowing the distance between them until they reached the ideal range he had set. In the next moment, two of the most powerful Fire God Origin crystals, each worth tens of billions, detonated simultaneously. Their value already exceeded the total fortunes of most peak King Immortals, and their destructive power was beyond imagination. Even if the three had attempted to instantly retreat, at such close range and without the ability to teleport, their escape speed could not match the rapid expansion of the explosions. Caught completely off guard, they had no choice but to endure the devastating impact. King Purple Bell's plan, as well as all prior records, had never accounted for the fact that Luo Feng's trump card included not just one but the strongest Fire God Origin crystals. No one would have expected someone to counterattack in such a ruthless, all-or-nothing manner. It should be noted that in a confined space, if the destructive force of a self-detonating Peak King Immortal is properly guided and concentrated, it can directly kill a Limit King Immortal, let alone Luo Feng's Fire God Origin crystals, whose power was 10 times greater. Of course, unlike a closed space, the explosive force in the vast void space disperses and is not targeted. Therefore, even with a tenfold increase in power, the actual amount and duration endured are limited. This is precisely why Luo Feng chose to simultaneously deploy two of the strongest Fire God Origin crystals. Even so, after King Heavy Arrow and the other Limit King Immortal fought with all their might to resist, they still lost about 50% of their divine body energy, causing their strength to drop sharply. And even with the protection of heavy-grade treasure, the Purple Bell, King Purple Bell's divine body was shaken to dust, losing over 50% of his divine body energy. Just as King Purple Bell thought he had survived the terrifying explosion and was celebrating the fact that he lived while Luo Feng supposedly perished, Luo Feng quietly struck again from the base of the Purple Bell. King Purple Bell had never expected Luo Feng to close in so quickly. After all, such a devastating explosion should have scattered everyone across thousands of kilometers, and with the time needed to reconstitute his divine body, even a brief interval should have been enough for a countermeasure. Yet the reality was completely different. Protected simultaneously by Shi Wu wings and the general grade armor, the explosion's force had already been reduced by over 99%, the remaining less than 1% was only enough to crack the Moyun armor and could not harm Luo Feng in the slightest. Moreover, before returning to Yanji continent, Luo Feng had further evolved the Moyun vine. Even at only the low-tier King Immortal level, its hardness rivaled that of a high-tier human King Immortal. Thanks to these layers of protection, Luo Feng emerged unscathed, requiring no recovery time, and charged straight at King Purple Bell, plunging his blade directly into his body. At this moment, King Purple Bell had just reconstituted his divine body and had no time to activate the Purple Bell for defense, allowing Luo Feng to effortlessly drive his blade, imbued with a poison that corrodes divine bodies, into him. By the time King Purple Bell realized the blade's deadly poison was rapidly eroding his divine body, it was too late to disassemble and discard the poison cells. All he could do was helplessly watch his divine body being consumed. The only action he could take before his consciousness dissipated was to connect to the virtual world and broadcast Luo Feng's coordinates to a large number of King Immortals in the Automaton faction. King Purple Bell never expected that the mass mail he had prepared before the battle, which he intended to avoid being defeated by Luo Feng even with the combined strength of three, would ultimately serve as his own last testament. Under normal circumstances, even if a powerhouse perishes, the virtual system would only notify contacts as unreachable because it cannot confirm their vital status. But since King Purple Bell's consciousness dissipated while connected to the virtual world, the system directly informed all contacts that he had perished. On the extraterritorial battlefield, when a powerhouse sends a message before death, it is often to entrust others with the intent of exacting revenge. Such messages rarely need verification, as their credibility is extremely high. Consequently, large numbers of automaton faction powerhouses quickly formed small squads and rushed toward the coordinates indicated in the message at top speed. However, because they did not know the exact situation, these alien powerhouses almost all chose to teleport tens of thousands, or even hundreds of thousands, of kilometers away from the coordinates. After all, veterans of the extraterritorial battlefield would never take reckless risks. Teleporting directly into the enemy's attack zone would mean immediately facing a terrifying strike. Wouldn't that be suicidal? The first groups of King Immortals to arrive were immediately stunned by the scene before them, too shocked to act rashly. As far as their eyes could see, spanning tens of millions of kilometers, everything had been reduced to nothing, and the aftershocks of the explosion reverberated for a long time, lingering endlessly. One could only imagine how fierce the previous battle had been. What shocked them even more was that the two famous Limit Immortal Kings had become Luo Feng's prey, desperately fleeing in disarray. In fact, when Luo Feng detonated the two strongest fire god origin crystals, they had thought him insane, choosing a mutually destructive method to retaliate against King Purple Bell. In fact, however, the terrifying explosion had consumed massive portions of their divine bodies, while Luo Feng emerged completely unharmed. If they had continued the fight, another detonation by Luo Feng would have inevitably caused their demise. Thus, when they reconstituted their divine bodies and saw Luo Feng charging straight at them after eliminating King Purple Bell, they had no time to think and no longer entertained the idea of joining forces, but they could only scatter and flee immediately. For Luo Feng, who could not teleport, the aid of the spatial lockdown weapon allowed him to target only one opponent, and naturally, the more severely injured King Heavy Arrow became his pursuit target. Seeing Luo Feng chasing King Heavy Arrow, the other Limit King Immortal seized the opportunity to escape the spatial lockdown's range, teleporting away from Yanji continent back to the Automaton faction's base. He even crossed the Automaton faction's territory and, in a secluded area, used Divine Kingdom teleportation to return to his Divine Kingdom. It should be noted that his massive loss of divine body energy had reduced his strength to less than 50% of his peak, making him unable to threaten even a peak King Immortal with ordinary attacks. Remaining on the extraterritorial battlefield would only leave him vulnerable to enemies. The heavenly materials and treasures capable of restoring his divine body were extremely valuable, enough to consume 50% or even all his accumulated wealth. Few powerhouses would dare pay such a price, which is why he chose to escape back to Divine Kingdom, planning to slowly repair his divine body over the coming billions of years by absorbing cosmic energy. As for King Heavy Arrow, who had become Luo Feng's prey, his fate was far more tragic. Skilled in long-range attacks, he tried to keep his distance and was forced to shoot a heavy arrow, but it proved completely ineffective against Luo Feng, who blocked it with sure Wu wings. Luo Feng gave him no chance to breathe, closing in at a gale-like speed, leaving him no opportunity to fire again. At the same time, Luo Feng unleashed his self-created pinnacle secret technique, striking with both sure Wu wings and the poison blade in succession, cutting through King Heavy Arrow's divine body. Sensing the venom eroding him, King Heavy Arrow decisively tried to disassemble and discard the poison cells. Yet, severely weakened, he was instantly entangled by Mo Yun Vine. Luo Feng took advantage of this, letting Missouri Yun Vine drive a few spikes that already coated with poison deep into his body, rapidly consuming his divine body energy and reducing it to less than 15%. Luo Feng carefully controlled the poison, which was not enough to cause King Heavy Arrow's complete demise, but sufficient to plunge him into a forced slumber, rendering him entirely unable to resist, leaving Luo Feng free to contain him in the world ring. You might wonder, why didn't Luo Feng simply finish off King Heavy Arrow and instead chose to capture him? What deeper strategy lies behind this choice? Feel free to leave your guesses in the comments. The hundreds of onlooking King Immortals fell completely silent, especially upon witnessing the two Limit King Immortals, one fleeing in panic, the other gravely injured and forced into a state of suspended slumber, which left them all deeply shaken. Some of the peak King Immortals sensed danger and decisively teleported away, fearing they might become Luo Feng's next target. However, the last batch of arriving King Immortals had not witnessed the previous brutal battle. Coupled with the fact that a large number of allied forces had already formed a blockade around Luo Feng, they feared that any delay would cause them to miss out on the treasures. One alien, blinded by greed, recklessly struck first, relying on the sheer numbers without knowing the true situation. Nearly 20 other powerhouses, emboldened by this, surged forward in a frenzy. Don't forget, according to their intelligence, Luo Feng was merely a high-tier king immortal or possibly even just at a lower tier. How could he possibly withstand over 100 king immortals? Little did they know, this was precisely part of Luo Feng's plan to establish his dominance. The temptation of the treasure was immense. Without sufficient deterrence, the aliens would keep coming in waves. Those opponents, 10 times weaker than a king limit immortal, became perfect sacrifices for Luo Feng's kill one to warn 100 tactic. The first unlucky victim was the high-tier king immortal who struck first. Luo Feng's combat power had now already reached the high-tier king immortal, combined with his self-created pinnacle secret technique, and the instantaneous burst of his speed was something that very few king immortals could match. With a single strike, there was almost no way to dodge, and the high-tier king immortal perished on the spot. The scene left everyone utterly shocked. What they did not know was that Luo Feng's battle blade had long been coated with deadly poison. The poison was far too expensive for anyone to even consider. Furthermore, in the midst of battle there was no time for hesitation, they could only attack in unison. Yet Luo Feng's movements were unpredictable and his speed extraordinary. Wherever his blade swept, it stretched like a river suspended in the void space, dazzling and lingering in brilliance. Each strike meant the death of a king immortal. In an instant, more than 10 enemies were obliterated one after another. The survivors' courage collapsed, and they scattered in panic. Luo Feng did not continue the slaughter as his purpose was deterrence, not massacre. After all, if he truly wiped out over 100 king immortals in a single battle, it would provoke widespread outrage and might even draw the attention of the automaton race's supreme powerhouses where the forces he could not yet contend with at his current strength. While the remaining enemies hesitated over whether to combine forces against him, Luo Feng decisively revealed his strongest fire god origin crystal, amplifying the intimidation. In the end, with the assistance of his friend, Luo Feng teleported away, and not a single person in the area dared to stop him. Looking at the dazzling river of blade light, that world-shaking battle still seemed to play before their eyes. One alien king immortal could not help but admit that Luo Feng deserved a title. From that moment on, the continent gained another human king immortal not to be provoked, King Blade River. Well, that's all for this video. Thanks for watching this video. Wish you a wonderful day.